The Arctic Climate Impact Assessment did come out in November of 2004, and the big scientific volume came out a year later. But the 2004 document really raised the awareness of people around the world of the dramatic changes that climate is having because they are so visible in the Arctic. We see sea level changes, we see melting of glaciers, we see mostly the impact on the residents who live in the north, particularly indigenous people. But what's really important about it is the awareness of the world that climate change. I have been told that the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment was the seminal event in the evolution of the climate change issue around the world, because as the Minister of Environment in Russia told me, Lavrov, it was the most powerful statement about science that had occurred in his lifetime. That's a really strong statement. So the initial impact was remarkable. Now what I worry about is that since then, while awareness has become greater, and almost all of the countries that are in the G8 and OECD countries, that we'll call them the more developed countries of the world, the awareness is high. The awareness is not high around the world. It is just not there. In China, in Africa, South America, places where we have emerging economies and developing economies, we don't see that awareness. So we don't have a global awareness, though the Arctic has dramatic impact on the highly developed economies of the world. But the disappointment in my mind is that while we've had 3 years, the movement around the world of change to do something about it has not changed a great deal. It really has not. But I do think now, over the last 6 or 8 months, we see a transformation of thought. Industry leaders are thinking differently. The United States administration is beginning to think differently. There are something like 125 laws being considered by the United States Senate now about climate change, and yet only 5 years ago there were 9. So there are things beginning to happen, so we see what I would call a morphing or a transformation. So we're in the middle of that process. So in conclusion about the Arctic assessment, it raised awareness. It has not permeated the full planet, but in the countries where there's highly developed economies, we're now seeing a movement.
But after these 3 years, do you see any gaps which is so clear that it should be addressed to the scientific communities?
Yes, there are many gaps that have occurred. There are scientific gaps, and let me talk about them, but there's some other gaps I want to talk about. The first are the scientific gaps. We do not know at this stage how to project the melting rates of glaciers, the change in the Arctic sea ice. So let's just stay at the Arctic level for a moment. Our ability to project with some accuracy the rate at which, say, Greenland is going to melt and hence influence sea level rise has high variability. IPCC says only a couple feet. Some of us say a meter or more, maybe as much as 2 meters this century, largely dominated by the melting of Greenland. So there's uncertainty in our ability to project that. I could talk about a number of other scientific things. We need to know better some of the feedbacks and the effect on vegetation. But the biggest misunderstanding, and I should say lack of understanding, is the consequence for humans on the planet. And one of the problems is, while we can predict ice and how it's changed, it's very hard to predict how human behavior will adjust and adapt. And it's why we need to raise the consciousness around the world about adaptation or coping with, because while we may work the mitigation problem, that is, reduce our carbon footprint around the world, reduce CO2 and methane and things like that, we really have to understand how we can adapt, because no matter what we do, the change is already in the system. There is right this minute enough energy stored in the ocean that if we stopped all greenhouse gas warming today, the planet would warm 1 whole degree centigrade more. So People are going to have to adjust. A degree is huge. It's about the change we've seen since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So we're going to double the impact just in the years ahead with almost no increase in greenhouse gases. So adaptation, the ability to adjust, to cope, to deal with the realities of climate change will be at our doorstep every day for the decades ahead.
But how do you think the Arctic human society could start to prepare to make a proper adaptation strategy to the climate change we are going to see?
Well, I think the Arctic communities, indigenous communities in perspective, have some real advantages over the rest of the world. First of all, these are communities that have been around for arguably 8 to 10,000, or 9,000 years maybe. Even in Norway, we know reindeer herding has been going on for 8 or 9,000 years, even as herders rather than free-roaming reindeer. And so they have faced many changes, some of which have been warmer periods, cooler periods. We had the medieval warming period, the Ice Age, and these communities have learned how to adapt and adjust. And so I'm optimistic that these communities will adapt and adjust in the years ahead. But the rest of the world is totally unprepared. Even in my country, the United States, the awareness to need to prepare is best exemplified by Katrina. Here we had a hurricane who, you can't say came from global warming, but is consistent with all the warming, because we know that the Caribbean was about 2.5 degrees warmer, and that we know for sure that that warming came as a consequence of the warming of the planet. So you can make some pretty good connections. And our country is not dealing with that. We're going to rebuild New Orleans exactly where it was before, and we're going to have it again. We are not prepared to recognize adaptation means you have to think clearly about what's going to happen in the 10, 20, 30, 40 years ahead. And I would argue that the United States needs to think quite differently about rebuilding in the lowlands like in New Orleans. Give you an example. During the latter part of the last century, the United States said, you know, when floods come, because we're getting more and more floods, and we see that in Europe, we see it in the United States, we see it around the world, we should not rebuild on the floodplains. And we did that in the United States. We moved tens of thousands of people when we had the big Mississippi flood, and we did not allow them to rebuild in the floodplain. That's a good thing. But some of the other things we haven't learned about. So I think that some of the countries in the more temperate parts of the world are going to have to learn to differently adjust to the changing climate, let alone what's going to happen in the tropics.
So you see then a clear ethical challenge in the issues of dealing with climate change?
Absolutely. The ethical issues are powerful because the world is affected by climate change. But the dynamics of climate change comes from relatively small parts of the world. Everybody knows the United States has been the dominant emitter of climate, CO2 greenhouse gas. 25% or thereabouts came from the United States. Nobody else had that level of, and yet China's now coming on strong. In fact, the daily emissions in China are greater than the U.S. It's sort of like a bathtub, however. The United States emissions have poured through this bathtub, and now China is putting more water per day in than we were, but the legacy is still there because CO2 is there for way over 100 years before it gets recycled. So we're going to have these differences, and we're going to have to deal with those among the various nations of the world because each of them is affected differently and are going to adapt differently as they face up to the climate change challenge.